Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And today we're talking about kind of a current-ish, I guess we're a little behind, study that made a lot of waves. And it's involved around women in health. So see our past episodes we've done around that. We've done several things about women as patients, as workers in the health industry. So definitely go seek those out. But yes, you've probably heard recently a new study out of Harvard made a lot of waves when it found that patients of all genders have better health outcomes when treated by women doctors. These patients were more likely to survive and less likely to be re-hospitalized. This study built on past studies that found that women doctors are more likely to invest and suggest in preventative care and counseling, and more likely when it came to uterus having patients to request for things like mammograms and pap smears. There was a similar study in Canada that was also pretty recent that produced similar results. So this is not really a new thing. To specify, though, the study was specifically focused on elderly hospitalized patients. From Medical News Today, Sugawa, which is one of the heads of the study, and his colleagues examined data from Medicare claims made between 2016 to 2019. The data included more than 458,100 female patients and more than 318,800 male patients. Roughly 31% of both the male and female patient groups were treated by a female doctor. The researchers reported that the mortality rate for the female patients when they were treated by a female doctor was 8.15%, compared with 8.38% when treated by a male physician. The researchers regard this as clinically significant difference. Among males, the mortality rate was 10.15% when treated by females, compared with 10.23% for males. So the study's lead author has expressed he expects backlash from this, but maintains that the methodology was analyzed multiple times. And some have criticized this study in terms of the fact that you're usually getting treated by a team when you're in the hospital. However, most still admitted we're failing women and minority patients, and there is something going on here. And so I know we've talked about this, but Samantha and I have had some recent experiences in our family and our group around health scares. And I will say my mom, she was hospitalized recently, and when she told me the story, it was so infuriating because it was like I was listening to an example from this, because she was like, nobody was really listening to me, and then they put me somewhere and didn't tell me anything, and nobody really knew why I was there, and they couldn't tell me why. And they were mostly men that were just like, what are you doing here? And she was like, great question. I would love to know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. What I will say for the newer stuff, I found fascinating, and I don't know what this is going to do and how things are going to switch up. I think it's going to be a key in like your nurses, because a chunk I don't think, except for my brother who was admitted to a hospital that was specialized in heart failure and surgeries and such as that. My mom and my dad, who were both hospitalized for an incident, it's been a lot, never really saw a doctor. The doctors were all teledoctors, and it was all the nurse who had to relay what was going on and do everything. Everything was literally, they brought in a monitor to do like a Zoom call, essentially. Of course, like everything's fine. But I found that fascinating. And each one of them, except for, I will say, okay, there was one doctor that I did not see who apparently was a woman that was caring for my dad. And the way she responded was so quick. Like she actually set up things as where my mom was kind of, who was only seen by men, was kind of like, we'll try some things. It was kind of that kind of conversation, which I'm glad they tested. They kept her a little longer than my father because of the types of tests. They actually had similar incidents of why they went into the hospital. It was pretty interesting in that result, but I was, because it was at the same hospital. So they went to the same hospital. They had two different interactions with many doctors. And again, this is also a small town, so they had to be like driven further away, and then the local hospital is still like small in comparison to like if there was actually something big, they would have been if you either driven to or like flown to a metro area to get to that because it was that type of hospital. So my experiences I think are a little different anyway, but I did note that when I was talking to my parents about their experiences when it came to the woman doctor, they genuinely trusted everything she said. I don't know what made the difference as where they felt like when the other doctor came in, everything was like a hit and miss type of thing, like throw against the wall and see what happens. So again, though, it wasn't exactly the same, but there was similar scenarios. So I did find that interesting.
Yeah. And there are a couple of reasons that the study kind of posits for why that might be. And, I will say anecdotally too, most of my experience has been with male doctors. And it's not that they were bad, but a lot of times I was just uncomfortable because they have like trauma and like if it requires you to, I don't know, take off your clothes or something. Like I just I would feel very uncomfortable. And, that again, that's a very specific case, but because we know that a lot more women than men do experience things like that I can see that being an issue as well. But yeah, going back to the study's findings were pretty striking. It found that in the US, quote, that approximately 32,000 fewer patients would die if male physicians could achieve the same outcomes as female physicians every year. They concluded that they couldn't pinpoint the exact reason for this, but there are a few theories. And, I want to be clear, these are theories, but women in general being better listeners, communicators, more empathetic. Another is women doctors tend to spend more time with their patients. A lot of women practicing are younger than men practicing. And this is something we talked about in a previous episode, but burnout is a huge problem for women in the medical industry, which is a part of why women are typically younger. But it means that the younger folks might be like more up to date on recent guidelines. If we're talking about elderly patients, I do wonder if there's something to do with the jobs men typically pursue versus what women typically pursue. This is just a thought of mine. I don't have anything to back it up. But I did, when I was reading it, I was like, I wonder if you're specifically focusing on elderly patients. I don't know. Another thing we've talked about, like shifting to the patient's side, is this long history of women's pain being ignored. There have been multiple studies that have shown that can lead to death or just like way worse outcomes. 10 years trying to get a diagnosis, longer than that, like being in pain that whole time. One of the quotes from the study was, there's limited training in women's health issues. And they also pointed out that medical trials still focus on men.
Right.
Still.
I find it interesting too, when it comes to like heart disease, it took so long for them to figure out that women's symptoms were different from men and not associating heart attacks with women in general. So the fact that the heart attacks became one of the leading causes of death for women and no one recognized that, everybody's like, oh, that's weird. Until like literally what, 80s, 90s? I don't think until 90s. And then in like 90s, 2000s, they had to have a campaign because people did not realize this or the doctors told them so little. Again, when my mom, this was like 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, when she went in for her major heart surgery, like she almost died, she had had symptoms for a week that men were telling her, it could be stress. And she was like, I don't know. It's weird because it's on my chin and my jaw and this jawline is really hurting. I think my neck's really hurting. There's something weird. And then finally someone would be like, oh my God, you're about to have a heart attack. Oh my God, your main artery is clogged 99%. You're about to die. Like essentially it took them that long. When she went to the doctor, I'm very proud of her because she persisted like, no, this is not right. This is not right. This is not normal. For at least three doctor's appointments, if not 4, to finally be like, we need to get you in surgery right now. You're going to die.
And that, unfortunately, so many people report that experience.
Right.
my mom, when her recent health issue, she was telling me her symptoms, and I was like, hey, just so you know, for a long time, the symptoms of a heart attack have just been presented in this way, which is how men see it. But women can have different symptoms. And some of the things you're telling me are those symptoms. So I just, want
so
you to know that maybe you should bring that up. But so many women have reported of kind of you're being emotional, you can't handle pain,
right?
Or like
which
something
is
like that.
Hilarious because we know that's the opposite is true. Like statistically, by all points, women handle pain much better than men.
Yes, I also think it's really interesting, and we should come back and look into this. But in my experience, the discussion around a heart attack was because men ate more meat,
right?
And they ate heavier things, and women, of course, are eating their salads or what have you, in this very gendered stereotype. So they aren't going to have one. But it was almost like, I remember when my dad had heart troubles, the whole conversation around it was, well, yeah, he's eating the steak and
cholesterol, forgetting genetics exist.
Right. But it did have that very obviously men are eating this and women aren't. They're sticking to the leaves.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, which is, it messed up in many, many ways. I would like to come back and look into that.
Right.
Because that's just what I remember from being a kid when my dad had his heart problems, was it just felt like, well, he eats steak.
Right.
Like, my mom eats steak. Oh.
Right.
Here's a quote from NBC News. The new research is part of a growing field of study examining why women and minorities tend to receive worse medical care than men and white patients. For example, women and minority patients are up to 30% more likely to be misdiagnosed than white men. Our pain and our symptoms are often dismissed, said Dr. Megan Ranney, Dean of the Yale School of Public Health. It may be that women physicians are more aware of that and are more empathetic. And going back to that heart attack thing we were just talking about, another study found that women having heart attacks were more likely to survive when being treated by a doctor who is a woman. Women, as I was kind of mentioning earlier, might feel more comfortable being open with another woman about things like, my cousin is a nurse and she used to joke, we know half the stuff you're saying is a lie when you come in, we ask you. So I can see it being more comfortable to be, upfront about certain things with a woman as a woman. The study did come out with a few recommendations: minimizing the gender pay gap and disparities in the industry. Yep. In general, only a third of practicing doctors are women, and the gap is worse, far worse in certain specialties. I believe in one of them, it was 1% was women. Addressing gendered gaps in care, both in practice and regarding patients' gender. The study authors do caution against switching doctors just based on race or gender if you have one you're comfortable with. The study authors were more interested in looking into why this difference exists in the first place, because if, regardless of gender, folks are getting the same training, then the outcomes should be closer.
Right.
Right. That was kind of their question. That something is not adding up here. But also, they pretty much end it with men do better. They kind of were maybe they were basically saying ask yourself some questions,
right,
about why this might be, and maybe the answer is out of your control, or I don't know. But they were, hey man, just maybe ask.
A big thing in this is because internships happen in clinical and practices, and that's where you learn a lot of attitudes
Yeah.
Like that, and I say this as a person who went through a whole practicum when I became a social worker and was told, don't do this, don't do this. They taught you biases. So if these biases exist, if it started with men to begin with, and then men are training other men and training other people and teaching this that way, that I think influences a lot. And I think that's a bigger conversation. And like, okay, who is speaking to who is mentoring whom? Because that's a big part of their studies as well. Sure, they do all that. But essentially, when you go in and doing it hands-on, it's a different take almost. And you are learning under someone else. And I feel like that is probably where we're seeing the big differences and who's saying what and teaching what type of attitude.
I think you're right. I think the teaching is a huge part of it. Friend Marissa of the show is a nurse, and she does a lot of teaching. And I'll hear her talk about it. And she has great students of all genders. She has bad students of all genders. But I feel like, because she's the teacher, she's more aware of those kind of things, just because that's who she is and what she knows. So I do think that's really important. And, you know, we all have biases we might not recognize. And I think it is easier to be like, here's a guy that looks like me. I'll mentor him. I'll take him under my wing or whatever. But yeah, maybe ask some questions about that. Well, if anyone has any thoughts about this, or if you're in the medical field or not, we have gotten a lot of messages about people's struggles to be believed when it comes to getting a diagnosis. So that is a huge problem. If you have any thoughts about that as well, please let us know. You can email us at stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff I Never Told You. We're on YouTube. We have a TeePublic store, and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer Christina, our executive producer Maya, and our contributor Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your favorite shows.